Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Sandra Reyes. I'm a member of LACNIC staff, and I'd like to welcome you to one new session of LACNIC webinar. Today we'll be speaking about Containerlab and Visual Studio Code in network design. The instructor is Alejandro Guevara, who will be introduced by Alejandro Acosta. And prior to that, let me tell you about how we'll be working so that you can make the most of this session. We have started on time, 11:30 sharp. We'll be having a 60-minute session. During the presentation, you can ask your questions in the Q&A blog or in the Q&A box. And maybe during the presentation, if you wish, you can answer the questions made in the Q&A box, or at the end, we'll give Alejandro Guevara a couple of minutes to answer all the questions you entered in the Q&A box. It is important to stress that this webinar will be entirely in Spanish. We have simultaneous interpretation into English, Portuguese, and Spanish, so you can choose the language of your preference. Finally, this session is being recorded, so in the next days, we'll be sharing this recording with you by email to the address you registered for this webinar. So that is all. Thank you for your attention. And now I give the floor to Alejandro Acosta. Alejandro, you have the floor. Hi, Sandra. And hi, Alejandro Guevara. As Sandra already mentioned, we're going to have a webinar that I think is a most interesting topic. Is about Containerlab and Visual Studio Code in network design. And two topics that are closely in line with LACNIC. We're involved with network design, and in recent years, the use of Containerlab has been most helpful for us at LACNIC. So I would like to introduce Alejandro Guevara. He's a seasoned network engineer with over 2 decades of industry experience. He combines his background with a passion for crafting seamless network solutions. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're aware that you're a most interesting event in Austin. So thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Alejandro is a friend of the House of the Internet. He has been with us in other webinars. So thank you very much for joining us today. The floor is yours. Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, Sandra, for this introduction. For me, it is always a pleasure to be with you, supporting you, and making my small contribution in all these various webinars and training activities you organize at LACNIC. Yes, today we'll be speaking about Containerlab and how we can use Containerlab in the sense of providing a solution for network design. And one analogy, I am product manager. I was product manager at Nokia, and been in the network world for more than 2 decades and having worked in the development of labs. So my first responsibility at Nokia was an API group where we had the concept of validation and so on for the customers. And 15 years ago, everything was done local hardware, and wiring was complex. You had to have the devices. It was costly and also cumbersome. So validation can be easily done with the control plane management. This can be used now with Containerlab. And I'm also a pilot in my free time when I have it. And I like to make an analogy between what I do in my leisure time and what I'm passionate for in my work, which is building labs. When you fly, you have tools that allow you to validate things in a secure environment that prevents you from making mistakes that can jeopardize your life. And here in your work, also, you can put your job at risk. So the flight simulator is like the analogy we can use in this context. So that is how I view Containerlab. I use this analogy. We can use this tool to validate, to simulate things prior to entering into production with our design. So let us now go to the point. How have you been working with network design traditionally? This is a very straightforward topology, but for the purpose of this webinar, this is enough. We have a cluster of services that are running in a specific application. That application has to have access to the internet. And we have a network of the devices that are connected to do multi-homing, and the one that is like the edge to the internet. So we have to validate this design to see if it works, the protocol we're going to use, and so on. Traditionally, the design team comes and said, well, this is the network I'm going to teach, I'm going to have this protocol, I'm going to have ISIS, and do the peering, I do my testing, my validation, and once I finish, I pass this on to the test team. The test team will run some kind of tests like control plane and convergence time for the protocols we're using and so on. But all these stages, as you see, take some time. And the design team designs the network. This is then delivered to the test team that does the validation, which might take days, weeks, months, depending on the complexity. And then, of course, we have the teams that currently have to deal with automation. We have the automation team. They have the scripts and the tools to do the automation of the services, etc. And of course, this does take some additional time. It might be even months, maybe sometimes even years. And after that, we deliver that to the operation team. First, they have to do internal capacity building for all the engineers who will be operating this network, and then validate all the provisioning tests required, provided by the automation team. So this, of course, this is done serially, and therefore it is too slow, particularly for the current network development requirements. Another solution would be to quadruplicate things, every team that is working on this time. But this is, of course, not at all efficient because you are sort of consuming resources. And if we're speaking about a virtual lab using tools, this is not that much. But we're saying that these are physical equipment. This is even more complicated. So it's not convenient to duplicate this because of the resources, and then there's no synchronization between each of the stages or the teams that are participating in this solution. Therefore, this type of approach is far too complex when validating the network design. So that is when Containerlab comes in as a very powerful tool to do analysis and validation of our designs. And the network we were speaking of, we can simulate every single element of the lab topology that was designed in Containerlab, not only the routers. Here we have the Nokia nodes with SRS, with SRS SIM, and when Nokia was SR Linux, which is connected to the peering. Then we can also simulate using Linux tools that are open tools, and many are free. This can be We can simulate the internet part with a container lab, which is Linux-based, using iPerf, running iPerf, or some BGP client. And in fact, with Alejandro, we organized a seminar some time ago where we used several tools doing BGP in IPv6. And then the clusters can be simulated through routing and switching in the container lab. So it's not only about simulating the network elements, but also about simulating the devices that can allow us to do validation, effective validation of our design. So within Container Lab, we are including the concept of lab as a code. This means that we can generate our topology in a way that is declarative. We express what we wish to build. We wish to build a topology with a given amount of nodes. For example, a data center with a layer with certain features and connection. And we simply declare this in a way which is user-friendly in a YAML file. This topology is done there. And then this makes it very flexible and open when working in different groups. Already spoke about the declarative part. We simply express the intention, what we wish to do in our lab. So when expressing this in a standard way, it's easy to share. It's shareable. It is container-based. It can be done rapidly. And as I mentioned, it is also an open environment. Container Lab is vendor agnostic. It is not linked to any vendor. Initially it was Nokia, but it is totally open multi-vendor tool, so anyone can participate. Container Lab has more than 300,000 installations, more than 100 people are contributing actively to the development of the tool. We support different vendors, and we are continually making upgrades to the platform. Right now, I think we are in version 0.7.1, but this changes every single day. Well, not every single day, but quite dynamically and frequently, the way Container Lab grows in terms of what it supports, its functionalities, and so on. So going to the concept of the lab as code concept, it is declarative through a file, through a format, which is a YAML, which is human-friendly, but can also be interpreted by an automated system, or like Containerlab in this case, which will be the one who will be converting that declaration of what we wish to build in the lab into a laboratory as such, and then execute it and have interaction with that lab. A further thing that I mentioned is that we can use Git. We can use GitLab, we can use GitHub for collaboration. We can have several devices at the same time. We can work on the same lab in order to have a pool with that lab. And if there are any changes, we can do synchronization with the different devices. So this can make it very versatile in terms of collaboration. It allows us to have versioning control. We start with an initial version, and then we said, let's use this protocol, and maybe as we go along with the design, we realize we have to make some changes. So we publish a new version of that lab, which can then be dynamically shared with all the other devices and the personnel that is working on that design. And quite obviously, how we can share this laboratory. Not only internally, this is used very frequently when we organize seminars. Last month we organized an event where we had a hackathon, and everyone was in a repository, a GitHub repository, And we then published the repository so that people could replicate this in the lab environment without any problem. I always mention how this can be shared with GitHub. If you design the lab, you do git push to GitHub or GitLab, and anyone can clone this laboratory. So having this in the lab format is very important. Regarding installing Containerlab, where it is supported today, you can run Containerlab directly in Linux. You can run it in Windows with WSL2, or also with Mac OS for those of us who use Mac. So there are different platforms. Any platform that supports Dockers can use Containerlab. What is the flow to install Containerlab then? First of all, you have to have Docker. This is a requirement. You have to have Docker installed. We can then clone an already existing lab, or also you can create a lab from scratch. I'm going to show this later on. And then using the Containerlab tool to deploy this laboratory with all the logs and all the connections, etc. You can then interact with the different devices. You can check the logs. You can access these using SSH or console, depending on the device. You can do modifications of the configuration, and then you have to synchronize this. And finally, you can save these configurations following by the push to the rest of the devices that are participating in this service. In terms of operating system, we have a large variety of vendors and operating systems. In Nokia recently, we introduced SR-SIM, which are the nodes that are now available. We also support a large amount of vendors. We have Juniper, Arista, Cisco, NVIDIA. Alejandro mentioned that we have done laboratories at Microtrick and so on, which is quite wide-reaching. But this goes beyond that. It's not only about having routers and switches. We also need to have elements to incorporate the topology to validation for whatever reason to do management. Right now, for example, we're doing telemetry. For example, we want to have a data collector which uses GNMI or GNMI-C, which is a tool that is being used. This is the official tool of OpenConfig for the purpose of subscriptions using models. In this case, it's YAM. That can be specific or open config models. So this provides us with the telemetry values, for example, the BGP sessions and the router, the traffic in a given interface. And this can be forwarded to a database. There are several flavors. We have Prometheus, which is used a lot for telemetry. We also have Influx database, which is also one of the most common ones. So this is what we show in a graphic environment or in a panel or a dashboard in Grafana with a very neat graphic showing how the traffic takes place, or if a port crashes or whatever, we can then identify the issues regarding operations. So going back to the topology, how do we express this in the Containerlab? We have 5 different elements that we want to develop. We simply express this in a YAML file, which is easy to understand, to read, and maybe write. Why not? So first of all, we express which are the types of devices that we're going to use. In this case, In the different types, we have Nokia SR SIM, which can be of several types. It can be Arista, Cisco, Nexus, a large variety, and everything is included in the documentation. Then the types of device, we can have various models. And then the Docker image that corresponds to that device. In Containerlab, you can download these automatically from the network if they're in a public registry, or otherwise we can build our own images in our host for Containerlab. So based on these types, we then declare our nodes. We are declaring a node which is P1, which is a Nokia SR SIM. And if necessary, I can also pre-configure my nodes so that when I start my session with Containerlab, it already has a pre-established configuration. Here we have the startup configuration file, which is pe3.cfg. And otherwise, you have the default configuration. So going back to the topology, we can see how we're going to develop the first node, which is an SR SIM, the second node as well. Then a third node is SR Linux. And then I can also simulate my testing elements. I'm going to simulate the internet with a Linux-based container, and a cluster also is going to be based with one based on Linux. Now, one of the things that was very helpful for this framework, or for this philosophy of continuous design, is that we can automate the entire design process. We start with a design team. Everyone is aligned in the design team, in the testing team, in the automation team, the operators team. And in Containerlab, we can even create tools for automatic provisioning developed by the validation team, and testing protocols that allow us to do in such a way that whenever we create a new version and do a commit in a Git, then automatically we can trigger an automated testing suite that tests whether everything that has been configured works correctly. And this is very helpful in container design. This slide shows how the design evolves from the initial version where a group worked on the first version, then more people joined in, and so on. We can include new persons and evolve in the networks, but we can also include automation tools. We are now using MCP servers, which allow us to create AI tools to interact with our networks. For example, we can do things that through natural language can say, well, I would like to see what the traffic looks like in this route, and we explain this in natural language, and this automated tool shows us how this can be done in a language that is understood by the laboratory without going to the Containerlab. So installing a Containerlab, you have a script that you can download from the Containerlab site. Basically, this downloads all the necessary elements to run Containerlabs, and in the end, you'll have a summary that shows that it has been installed and which version it is. So let's wait until it finishes, a couple of more seconds. So now we have installed Containerlab. There it is. Okay, here let me show you the last part. And at the end, you have a screen that looks like this. Containerlab is installed, and the version that was installed in this case, it is 06H.0. I think the last one was 071 or 072. But that's so that you get an idea. And then you can install this in any of these operating systems. So how do we deploy this? Once we have the file, we simply go to the command line and put clab deploy. This is automatically deploys the nodes and the connections, and also any additional load. And then we have the summary of all the nodes that were used. Once this is done, we can control, do SSH or console from any of the nodes deployed. And this is a node through SSH. Now this goes a bit beyond. Recently, and the community within Containerlab is most active. We have more than 100 persons who are actively collaborating and creating new plugins and new tools to use Containerlab. And recently, plugin was created in Visual Studio Code. I don't know if any of you have heard or worked with Studio Code. This was used in the past for scripting, for example. But because we have this concept, many people use Studio Code as a tool to write the topology files. So we can create a plugin in this way to have a more dynamic interaction with Containerlab. As I said, this picks up the concept of lab as code. This takes this a step further. With this code, we can have a more dynamic interaction with another lab. This plugin can be installed. It's in the marketplace of Visual Studio Code. You go to the icon here, where you have the different elements that you can install. You look for the Containerlab, and you can find the plugin. Once you install the plugin, you'll have a screen that shows you the topologies that you have in the Containerlab, and this will allow you to do a number of things. You can visualize your topology graphically, you can interact with your topology, you can add nodes, you can eliminate nodes, you can modify the type of nodes, you can interact with different nodes. The interesting thing here is that as you do the changes in the graphic part and add elements or comments, the topology is a YAML file that could have been created manually, is then modified as we modify the topology that we have on the left. This is a most powerful tool. And if you look at on the left side, you can interact directly with the different interfaces. You can see the nodes that were deployed together with the specificities. So we can take control of SSH node. You can see this over here. And then you can execute your commands in each of the nodes, or also change the configuration. In this case, we're assigning details in IPv4. I'm sorry, Alejandro, we're not using IPv6 in this case, but in another case, we could use IPv6. I know you're all IPv6 fans, but I wanted to keep this example simple. And this is a tool we tried to do ping with the interface that we have just created. We see that the ping does not work. So what is a tool that we have always used? We continue using Wireshark. What if we used Wireshark from this screen where we developed this? First, we designed the lab, we deployed the lab, we did changes in the topology and connections, and now this allows us to verify if a topology was created or if the configuration is correct. So we do traffic analysis directly with the links in this node. So I simply could open a screen in Wireshark, which is embedded, and this allows me to check where these are sent, but nobody's answering. Now, this is very powerful to see other types of things, to see if there's an adjacency, if that is working, and so on. And one other thing that I already mentioned is that we can see the topology and the nodes and how they have been deployed. Depending on the topology, we have the YAML file. And one of the other things that we can do is that we can run several loads and labs at the same time. How we can connect.
Podemos hacerle clic derecho o utilizar los iconos que están aquí al lado del nombre. Hay varios iconos. Hay un icono para los logs.
We have an icon for the logs, one for console. And if we can configure an IP, we can do SSH, but we can enter through console. And if a node didn't pick this up, we can check the logs to see what happened. Or if there's a device that already has an SSH server configured, we can do this option. We see the DCSH, and this is most powerful. One of the other things that I mentioned is that when we click on the topology, or we do right click, we can go to the viewer here, and we have the image of what we have deployed. We can readjust the nodes as we like. And one of the interesting is that once you have readjusted the nodes, Containerlab creates a meta file with the location of the nodes regarding the topology. So you've turned off the lab and turn it on again. The nodes will be in the same place where you left it the last time. Already mentioned this. How powerful it is to have a tool like Wireshark, which is already used by all of us. Sorry, I see that you are going to Wireshark, but we have 3 questions, and maybe I'd like to ask you to stop here. There are 2 questions from Wilson Velis. He said, what distro of Linux would you recommend to install Containerlab? And here's another question, which you can link to the first question. What resources, what host hardware resources, CPUs, RAM, storage, do you recommend to install in Containerlab? Resources, okay. So let us start with the distro. With this lab, and I mentioned this already, with this lab, I'm running this on a Mac. I have another lab at home, but this is done in my lab, so it's more portable. So right now, I'm using a tool that many of you have heard about. This is my lab, which is live. This is no recording. This is running on a virtual machine, which is the one you have over here. As you can see, I'm running this on Debian, and I'm using Bookworm. Regarding the settings, I use the disk of 40 giga. This is 33 gigabytes. So depending on the complexity of the laboratories, the lab I have at home is on an Ubuntu. Ubuntu is ideal, but also Debian is ideal for installing Containerlab. Regarding resources, I'm showing this in this lab that you have right now. It is running in my lab, in the virtual machine that I have here. This is quite a complex topology. Look at all the nodes I have here. I have 7 different nodes. They're running a full BGP, an MPLS, and my machine currently is an M4 with 36 RAM, but it's also running other things at the same time. So I think that a machine with 32 RAM
con, yo diría 8 cores y
8
guárdense algo así como 40
cores,
gigas de espacio.
well, 40
Eso
gigas
les
of
da para
space
montar una
is
topología
enough to set up a
bastante completa. Yo
complete
creo que con eso respondo
topology.
las dos
I
preguntas,
think this
¿cierto?
answers the 2 questions.
Las preguntas
Sí,
de Wilson.
totalmente.
Yes,
Gracias por ello.
thank you.
Vamos a pasar con una tercera
So we have
pregunta
a
del
third question
señor Wilson.
from
Él
Wilson
indica, cuando
Willis.
se
He
declara la
says, when you
imagen del
declare
NOS,
the image
se
of the
requiere que el host
NOS,
tenga acceso a
it requires
Internet.
that the host
¿Cómo
has
se hace
access to
cuando
the
el host
internet.
no tiene
What do you
acceso
do
a
when the
Internet?
host doesn't have
¿Existe alguna
access to the
ruta de
internet?
validar
Is
las
there a kind
imágenes?
of route where you can validate the images?
Buena pregunta.
Good question.
Como todo esto está basado en container,
Everything is container-based,
podemos utilizar
and that
tanto
is why
imágenes
we
que se
can
encuentren en registros
use
públicos
what we have in the
o
public
en registros privados. ¿De qué
registries
depende
or
esto?
private registries.
Vamos a decirlo claro y raspado,
This
esto depende del vendor.
depends
Hay
on the
vendors que son muy
vendor.
celosos,
Some vendors are
incluyéndome,
very jealous,
que ciertas imágenes las tenemos
and
públicas,
certain
ciertas
images are
por
published
temas de seguridad, porque las imágenes
for
normales,
security
por ejemplo,
reasons,
temas de
reasons,
lawful intercept y temas de validación de
and
temas de
because
seguridad,
of security and
esas
validation,
imágenes no las distribuimos
these images
públicamente.
are not
Se las
publicly
distribuimos a nuestros
distributed. They
clientes
are distributed
que tienen acceso a su
to
plataforma.
clients
Ve,
that
por
have
ejemplo, la
access to
imagen de
this
esto de Linux
platform. The
es
image
libre.
of
La página
Linux is
de
free.
COS
The
de Arista es libre
CFS
también.
of Arista is also
Hay
free.
muchas que si Containerlab no las detecta
If Containerlab does
temprano, por
not
ejemplo, si yo
detect
entro
these,
acá y yo hago un Docker
if I
images y
put
envío al server,
Docker
esas son todas
images
las
and
imágenes que
so
yo
on, these
tengo
are all the images
actualmente en
that I
mi,
currently
y algunas
have,
que estoy creando yo por
and
temas
some
que
of the
estoy
ones
jugando
I'm
con unas
creating,
tecnologías nuevas.
because
Pero vean que, por
I'm
ejemplo,
using some new
tengo la del
technologies, but I
Nokia
have the one of
StarSIM, tengo la
Nokia,
27,
StarSIM
257R1, pero esta es local
27,
porque
257
tengo también
R1, which is
corriendo un
local.
registro
I
local
also have a local
para este tipo de imágenes que no
registry
son
for these
distribuidas
images
públicamente.
that
Entonces,
are not
si la,
distributed
si la
publicly.
imagen es
So the image
distribuida públicamente o
is publicly
libremente,
distributed or
Containerlab es lo
freely
suficientemente
distributed because
inteligente para bajarse
Containerlab
la imagen
is
directamente
smart
desde
enough to
del registro público.
take these from the
Si
public
no,
registry.
o te
Otherwise,
toca crear la imagen
either you have to create the image
localmente
or
en tu host
locally
o
in your
crear
host
un registro privado.
or
Esa
create
es
a
la,
private
crear un registro privado es
registry.
algo muy sencillo. De hecho, eso es
Doing
algo
this
que
is very simple.
pueden buscarlo en
You
internet.
can look
Son como
this up
4
in the
líneas
internet.
de
It's
comando.
about 4
Y
command
inclusive tú
lines,
puedes correr
and you
un
can even
registro
run
dentro de un
a
Docker, dentro de un
registry
container,
in
y exponer el
a
puerto. En este caso,
container.
yo tengo un registro que está
For
corriendo
example, in
aquí.
the ports, I
Este es
have one that
mi
is
private repo o private
my
registry, que
private
está corriendo en
registry.
localhost en el puerto
The
6500.
local
Entonces,
host is
toda
running
imagen que yo
on
sé
port
que Containerlab se
6500.
va a jalar
So
de
Container
afuera, yo le digo,
Labs
no,
will
intenta primero
first
en el repo local
take this from
y
my
bájate de
local
ahí, si no,
repo,
ve a internet. Y bueno,
allowed
y si
it
internet
download
no
it from here,
está
and otherwise it can
disponible, me
download
da un
from the
error.
internet. And if
¿Listo?
it's not available,
Vale,
I get
bien.
an
Dos
error
últimas
message.
preguntas y ya
There are 2
paramos por el
last
momento, porque ya
questions.
empezaron a llegar.
Ok.
Bueno,
Bueno, de
te
hecho,
pregunto las preguntas
antes
de
de
una en
seguir,
una.
te cuento algo.
Well,
En
before going
cuanto
on,
aquí,
let
¿dónde están
me
las cosas? Ok.
tell you something.
Sí, en cuanto, sí, podemos seguir con las preguntas.
We can continue with
Porque
the questions
básicamente
because
esta es la parte que
basically
quería hacer que fuera bastante interactiva.
this is
Y
the part that I
gracias por
wanted to be have
no
be
la
very
introducción, sino más
interactive.
el darme el pie hacia
So
esto,
thank you for
porque en verdad
giving me the chance
que
to
me gusta
refer to this.
cómo ha estado la participación y que en verdad mostrarles directamente en el escenario
And
del lab
I'd
que tengo.
like to show you directly
Pero
the
sí,
scenario that I
continuamos.
have. But yes, let's continue with the
Bueno,
questions.
entonces fíjate lo siguiente, es que hay varias preguntas y
There are
todas son más o
many
menos las mismas.
questions, and
Así que
you
capaz que te vamos a
all
pedir
have to
que lo
do with the
vuelvas a
same
hacer.
thing. So maybe you can
Ok.
repeat
En
this.
resumen,
So to
conectar
sum up,
el Visual Studio Code
connecting Visual
al
Studio
Container Lab.
Code to
¿Cómo lo
the
hiciste
Container
paso a
Lab.
paso?
How did you do that? Step
Listo.
by step.
Buena pregunta. Voy para allá. Una vez que tú tienes,
Once you have,
yo voy a abrir un terminal, pero
I'm
tu
going to
terminal
open
tú
a
lo puedes abrir
terminal, but you
con
can
Secure
open your
CRT,
own terminal.
es simplemente un terminal
This is
hacia el
simply
host.
a terminal to
Del
the
mismo que yo puedo
host.
correr mis comandos de Docker, yo puedo hacer un Docker
I can
PS y veo todos los
do
containers
a
que estoy
Docker
corriendo en ese
PS.
momento. Puedo hacer un CLab
I
y
can do
spec,
a
que esta es la manera
CLab
tradicional como
spec.
interactuamos con Containerlab.
This is how we interact with the Container Lab.
Bueno, y veo todos los nodes
And
que
I
están
can
corriendo en este
view
momento.
all the things that are running at this
Y
time,
esto asumiendo que no tengo el Visual Studio Code plugin
assuming that I
todavía.
don't have the Visual
Todo lo hago
Studio
a través de
Code plugin
install.
yet.
Para instalar el plugin, ustedes se
To
vienen
set
acá
up the
al
plugin, you
Marketplace
go to Marketplace here on the left,
o lo que llaman los extensions de
or what we
Visual,
call the
Visual Studio
extensions
Code
of Visual Studio
y
Code,
buscan Container
and you look for Containerlab.
Y en algún momento nos
And
va a
at
aparecer
some
el plugin. Aquí
moment,
está. Se demora un poquito. Y lo hacen clic. En este caso ya yo
you
lo tengo
click
instalado.
here.
Pero es tan
This
fácil
is
como decirle
installed, but it's
install.
as easy as clicking
Y
on
luego,
install.
inclusive, luego de que le hagan install,
And even once you
les
click
muestra la
on
documentación, qué
install,
pueden
you can
hacer con
see the
él,
documentation, what
etcétera,
you can do
etcétera.
with
Está
it.
muy bien documentado. Vean que tiene muy buenos ratings.
It has
A
very
nivel
good
de, lo ha
ratings.
bajado ya cerca de 10,000
It has been
downloads tiene
downloaded
ya
almost
el plugin.
10,000
Es
times.
muy seguro.
So it
Y
is
cómo
very
puedes interactuar entonces
secure,
con el plugin.
and you can
Y esto es
interact
tan
with the
fácil como
plugin.
darle aquí install.
This
Yo lo
is
puedo
as
deshabilitar, lo
easy
puedo
as
habilitar.
clicking on
Ejemplo, si no
install.
lo
I
quiero usar en algún
can
momento,
disable
etcétera.
it. I can
Lo
uninstall it if I
interesante es
wish.
que
Now, the interesting
luego de que
thing
ustedes lo
here
instalan, les
is
aparecer
that
este icono que está acá. ¿Y lo ven? El icono de Containerlab.
you
Y
can
cuando usted
see
le hace
here
clic,
the icon
entramos
of
como en el nuevo
Containerlab.
Containerlab de Visual Studio Code, donde de un lado vemos la
And
topología o el laboratorio que tengo acá.
I can see the topology
Nos
that
muestra
I
también
have
los laboratorios que
here.
no han sido desplegados. Por
These
ejemplo, este es un
are some
ejemplo
that haven't yet been deployed.
para el webinar, que un simple laboratorio. Lo copio aquí y me muestra aquí la topología que hice para este laboratorio. Un laboratorio sencillo de 2 nodos. Y puedo hacer split del screen y ver
And here I
el código
can
también.
split the
Puedo hacerlo
screen
también
and
con
see
este
the
ejemplo.
model, and I can also do it with this
Vamos a cerrar
example
esto. Vamos a cerrar esto.
here.
Por ejemplo, tengo otros
For
lab acá.
instance,
Tengo un lab que estaba haciendo en estos
I
días
have
para
this
streaming
app
telemetry.
that I was
Esta es una
developing
topología un
these
poquito más
days.
compleja.
This is more
Pero
complex, but
lo importante es que
the
tengan de este
important
lado el
thing
panel de
is that in
interacción.
this
Voy
side,
a volver a la
you may
topología que
have
estamos utilizando ahora.
the interaction panel.
En este panel, por
In this
ejemplo, si le
panel,
dan al
for instance,
candadito, ahorita
if you
está
click on
cerrado. Si
this,
lo abro, yo puedo
now
mover
it's
los
closed,
nodos,
but
puedo
if
reacomodarlos
here I can
y puedo detener el lab
reaccommodate it, and you
para hacer
may
alguna
have the lab
modificación y luego
for make
arrancarlo. Puedo
changes.
inspeccionar los nodos
I
para
can
ver qué tipo de
inspect the
nodos son. Yo
nodes
quiero ver las
to see
propiedades.
what they are. I can see the
Veo que en este
properties.
caso es
I see that
cuál es
in
el
this case,
tipo,
I
cuál es la
see
imagen que estoy
the
utilizando, etcétera,
type, what they
etcétera.
are using, etc.
Puedo hacer control del nodo
I
directamente,
can
puedo hacer
control the node.
SSH, puedo
I can
hacer
do
shell,
SSH
puedo ver
and
los logs
shell,
cuando fue creado, si
or
hay
I
algún
can
tipo
see
de
where
error.
there are any
Puedo
errors
simplemente hacer
when it was
SSH,
created, or do
correr mis
SSH,
comandos, show
or
memory instance default, protocol,
the
BGP,
protocol, BGP,
summary, me muestra todo lo que está
summary. It
ocurriendo acá,
shows me everything that's
etcétera,
happening
etcétera,
here,
etcétera.
etc.
Pero la instalación es tan
But
simple como venir
it's as
al
simple
marketplace,
as
buscar
coming to the
Containerlab y darle
marketplace
install. Ya,
and
eso es
looking
todo.
at
Y
this
luego les
there.
aparecer este icono.
And there you are.
¿Listo?
Ready?
Gracias.
Thank you.
Oh, sí.
Seguimos con
Y las
workshop.
preguntas pueden seguir.
So, and the question is, yes,
Porque básicamente la
basically,
presentación,
the
lo último que les
presentation,
voy a presentar,
the
bueno,
last thing
obviamente
that
ya
I'm going
vimos
to
lo
present,
de
of course,
Wireshark,
we
que es
saw
súper
the
poderoso. De
workshop
hecho, ahí
that
le
is
doy el
very
reconocimiento
powerful.
a
As a matter
Ernesto
of
Sánchez, que
fact,
no sé si está
I
por ahí
wanted
en
to
la
acknowledge
presentación. Él nos
Ernesto
ayudó un
Sanchez,
montón con esto.
who's there.
Sobre
He
todo
helped us a
cuando
lot.
la primera vez que vimos
And the
Shark
first time that we saw
funcionando con
Shark
Containerlab, eso
working,
fue, eso nos voló
that
la mente.
we were shocked with that, of course.
Pero sí,
But yes,
laboratorio example,
the
ejemplo, ¿dónde pueden encontrar
example lab,
inspiración
where
ustedes
can you
para
find
nuevos
inspiration
laboratorios? Mira,
for the lab?
esta topología que de hecho es una de las que
Well,
mostré que tengo,
I
que no está
showed
ocurriendo en mi
this
lab ahorita
topology
porque es un
that
poquito
is not
demandante a
running
nivel de
in my
recursos.
lab
Esto es un lab
because,
de
well,
telemetría
it
donde
was
tenemos
in
un data
telemetry
center
where we have a data.
con una arquitectura cloud con 3 clientes y estos 3 clientes están generando tráfico y podemos ver en Grafana cómo está el gráfico y cómo están
And
los
there you
puertos. Por
see
ejemplo,
the
si deshabilitamos
chart
un puerto,
and
se
the
va a ver acá que
ports.
se
If
pone en
we
rojo en el
disable a
switch.
port, then the
Podemos ver cómo
switch
está el
goes
estatus
red and we
de
see the
BGP,
status of
podemos ver cómo
BGP.
está el tráfico
And
corriendo,
we
los
can
links
see the
cambian de color según
traffic,
el
the links
tráfico
that
que esté
change the
corriendo en cada uno de
color
los links.
depending on the traffic in
Este
each
lab es
link.
público,
And this
por ahí les
lab
voy a
is
pasar el
public.
QR code
I'm
para que lo
going
escaneen.
to
Va a
show
estar en la
you
presentación cuando se las comparto.
the presentation. I'm going
Pero
to
este es uno de
share
los
it.
labs que a mí me encanta porque
And
no
then
solamente
what I
ve
love
el tema
is
de cómo desplegar los nodos, la topología, sino
not
también
only
la
do we
parte
have
de
to see how
telemetría.
the nodes work, but
Estamos
also
desplegando
telemetry.
un
We are
GNMIC, que es el que hacemos en
implementing
la
an
institución,
EMSC that
extracción de los
is
datos. Estamos haciendo,
we are
desplegando también la base de datos
we are
con Prometheus
deploying the
y
database
estamos
with
desplegando también un
Prometheus
dashboard con Grafana.
and with
Hay
Grafana.
otros ejemplos, por
There's
ejemplo,
another
este es un
example.
lab
For instance,
que
this
estamos
is a lab
utilizando
that we
para
are
segment
using
routing
for segment
y estamos
routing,
utilizando
and we are using
para hacer optimización de
to
latency. Esto
use
es otro lab
latency
que creo que es
to
público
control
también.
latencies. This is another
Otro lab
public
para
lab,
todo lo que es tema de
another lab
automatización.
for automation.
Aquí hay
And here
otra serie de
we
labs
have
que también
another series of
los estamos
labs
compartiendo.
that we are
Simplemente
also
escaneen el
sharing.
QR code o
So
usen
just
el
you
link que
need
va a
the
estar en la
QR code
presentación
and look for the link in the presentation, and you just look for this repository and you deploy it. Of course, if you have the images in the telemetry, it's what I showed. You don't need a license, you don't need any private images. You can deploy this directly, and this is an example so that you may get familiar with Containerlab. So we started the cycle of questions, so let's see if there are any more questions. So we may have time for some additional questions. Alejandro? Yes, good. Well, your presentations always bring some questions. Wilson Bellis is asking, well, thank you for your answers. In the topology, do you have any limitations in the interface ports that can be used? For example, 58 ports and the uplinks are 47 and 48. Well, it depends on the vendor. For instance,
por un tema de que en las topologías o en los equipos de SAR Linux, en la serie IXRD, los puertos de alta velocidad son los últimos puertos. O sea, los puertos en este caso de 400, de 800 gigas son los últimos, y los puertos de acceso, que son los de 25, 10 o 1 giga, son los primeros puertos. Simplemente un tema de diseño. Pero eso está más atado al vendor como tal, qué topología estás utilizando o qué tipo de dispositivo utilizando por cada vendor. Pero eso no hay ninguna limitante de que tiene que ser un puerto específico para Uplink. De hecho, si tú construyes tu topología toda utilizando los puertos de 25 GB, acuérdate que aquí tú no estás probando throughput, aquí estás probando solamente control plane y management. A pesar de que puedes pasar tráfico, pero muchos vendors, aparte que esto no está acelerado para utilizar ningún tipo o no está diseñado para utilizar ningún tipo de aceleración por hardware con SRIOV ni nada como eso. Tu throughput va a estar bastante limitado, y eso no es un tema de container, es un tema más porque estás corriendo dentro de un host y esto es una topología, vamos a decir, una simulación, no estás corriendo dentro del hardware real, pero no hay limitación de qué puerto puedes utilizar para conectar tus dispositivos, ninguno.
Vale, dos preguntas aquí del señor J. Luorio. ¿Cuál es la diferencia de Containerlab versus GNS3 versus IFNG, que son muy utilizados hoy en día? Existen ventajas de escalabilidad, performance, en cuanto a consumo de recursos. ¿Qué necesitamos para armar topologías grandes?
Ok. Listo. La ventaja fundamental, porque de hecho, en estos días me tocó hacer una labor de evangelización, por decirlo de alguna forma, con gente y yo no estoy diciendo que EVNG o GNS3 sean malos, no, cada quien tiene su propósito, pero una de las
I'm
cosas
not
que
saying
yo hice énfasis al principio de la presentación
I
es el tema del
emphasized at the
scope,
beginning
donde
that we have the
es un
levels
formato
full.
estándar, un
There were a
formato que
standard format
puede ser utilizado por un
that
interpretador
may be
como
used
Containerlab,
by an interpreter as
y
Containerlab.
es fácil o es
It's
amigable para los
easy
humanos
or
para leer,
it's
por el
friendly
tema de
to read
diseñar el laboratorio.
for the
Eso nos da
lab
mucha
design,
ventaja desde el punto de
and
vista
that
de
gives many
colaboración.
advantages from the point of view of
Colaboración, control de versiones,
control of
y
versions,
el tema también
and
de la
also the
escalabilidad.
issue of scalability.
Yo les mostré
I
el
showed
plugin de
you the
VS Code,
plugin
donde podemos
where
apalancarnos de
we
esta
can
herramienta para
make use of
tener
this
una
tool
interfaz mucho
to
más
have
amigable
a much more friendly,
para interactuar con
user-friendly
Containerlab. Pero
interface
eso no es
to
necesario.
interact,
Es
but this is
simplemente
not
algo
really
que nos
necessary. This is
permite de
something
una
that
manera
makes it
gráfica o de una
possible
manera más
for us
dinámica interactuar con
graphically,
el
more
lab.
dynamically to use the
Pero
lab, the
Containerlab a
container lab,
nivel
but
de
container
recursos y a
lab
nivel
in terms of resources
de la facilidad o la
and
flexibilidad que te da
the flexibility that it
o
has,
lo ligero que es
or
en
to
términos de
show
recursos
how
para desplegar topologías
how
bastante
little
complejas.
resources it needs to
Entonces,
use
ahí es
for
donde
complex
Containerlab se
things.
destaca
So
sobre las otras
Container
herramientas que de
Labs
repente son
stands
una herramienta
out
gráfica
among
que,
other tools that
vuelvo y
may be
repito, no
graphic tools, and
estoy
I
en contra de
repeat
ellas,
that
muchas
I'm
de
not
ellas cumplen
against them.
su
Many
objetivo.
of them
Si quieres desplegar algo rápido, donde
do
todo
their
se trae
job
drag
if you
drop
want to
y te
deploy them
conectas con un
quickly.
cablecito, cosa que lo puedes hacer en
And
Containerlab también a través
you
de
can
Visual
do
Studio
this
Code.
through
Pero
Container
Containerlab
Lab
te
too,
brinda
but
esa
Container Lab
facilidad.
gives
Estuvimos
you
hablando
that
antes de la conferencia,
ease.
Alejandro,
before the conference with Alejandro, we were discussing that to guarantee the construction of your lab, let's imagine that you're going to use this at a university, and we want to create a lab, an independent lab for each group of students, and we can see the parameters on file. And if you consider the environment variables and the requirements, we can see what IP addresses are going to be used for the management of each group of students so that they will step on each other's feet. So we can develop an automation script with the topology for group A and for group B, etc., etc. Another thing is, if we wanted to deploy things massively, having that ease of having a code is much easier, much more flexible, and much faster, much lighter. Good. I don't know whether that answered. Yes, I share much of what you said. And, okay, I think that it will depend. Oh, we are not quite. Well, another platform, and if it works, that's wonderful, wonderful, if you can use another platform. Yes, indeed. A couple of questions more. Does it support firewall Fortinet? I don't. Does it support firewalls as Fortinet? I don't know. But if you see the documentations of Containerlab, I'm sharing it now. This is the official website of Containerlab. If you look at times here you have all the different IPs that we support today. I don't see anything of Fortinet. However, let me tell you something. These are the images that are validated at present for Containerlab, MikroTik, Huawei, Dell, Sonic, Juniper, Nokia, etc., etc. Everything that we support officially. Now, that doesn't mean that if there's an image there that you can test, you can try, and it works, of course you can deploy it. And you can even make a comment in the community, a pull request, and say, well, I think that this may be of use, and of course it will be validated, and it can be included among these here. Oh, you see, Fortinet is here. Getting Fortinet, FortiGate disk image. Yes, so you can search it. Yes, because for instance with Linux, yeah, oh, with Apache. Yes, you can do a Tocqueville of your own image. In a past event, I talked with a guy here that's a celebrity in network automation. I had a pleasure to meet him, John Kodiarko. He works with the SAP servers, and he poisoned my mind. So I'm working with that. And I had to create an image of the CP server, and it's an image that I created. And it's you would think that that is in Linux, but I'm using that image from within Containerlab with no problems. Those are images that are in Docker, but that's another issue. If you go to Containerlab and you put VRNet, this is an open project that basically it's based on the fact that even in Nokia we use it a lot. We used it a lot when we didn't have the image in containers. That's very. We used this project makes it possible for you to take an image, a traditional VM image, and to turn it, to convert it. So if you, even if it's not here, you can try and maybe you can use it. Ready? Okay. There are two questions here. I think that, well, it says, Wilson Valley says, are there any limitations of quantity of service given that you don't have line cards?
No, bueno, de hecho,
Well, as a matter of fact, it all depends on,
sí, lo que no hay es
well, yes, what we don't have
el
is
throughput que
that
estás
the throughput
simulando no es el
that is
real de la
simulating
interfase. Por
is
ejemplo,
not the
cuando tú
real
das un
one of the
puerto de 25 GB,
interface.
obviamente
For
no es un
instance,
puerto de
if
25
you're
GB,
using a
por ende,
25
el tema del manejo
20
calidad de
giga
servicio
port,
no es, vamos a decirlo, one to one, por decirlo de
it's
alguna
not
manera.
one-to-one.
Pero sí se pueden hacer algunos tipos de
But
trucos,
you
por
can
ejemplo, bajarle el
use
bandwidth de una interfase, etcétera, para hacer. Pero eso ya es
other
cuestión del
things,
vendor. Eso va
but
más allá
that's a
de
vendor
Containerlab como
issue.
tal.
It's beyond Containerlab.
Okay.
Okay.
Tenemos aquí
So here, well,
del
probably
señor-
this is
del
the
señor
last question
Simón Pérez Córdoba.
by Simon Perez
Primero
Cordova,
indica
who
muy buen
says,
webinar. Consulta.
well, very good
Volviendo al
webinar.
tema
I have a
network
question.
as a
Going
code.
back to network as a code,
Entendería que
would you,
Containerlab es mucho
I
mejor
understand
fabricante
that Containerlab is much
para hacer
better
configuraciones
for
custom-made.
simulations for
¿Quieres ampliar un
custom-made
poquito en esto?
integrations. Could you
Se cortó hace
expand
un
on
momentico,
that?
¿puedes repetir? Disculpa.
Could you repeat that,
Okay.
Se cortó
please?
un momentico, se cortó la comunicación
Because
un segundo.
I
Volviendo al
lost
tema de
the
network as a
connection.
code,
Going
entendería.
back to network as a code,
Okay. Volviendo al tema de network as a code,
going back
entendería
to
que
network as a
Containerlab es
code,
mucho más
I would
idónea
understand that
para hacer
Containerlab is
simulaciones e
much better
integraciones
for
con APIs
simulations
de
of
algún fabricante,
integrations
para
with
hacer
APIs of
integraciones
a
custom-made.
vendor
Cuestiones de
to
tener
make
varios
custom-made
desarrolladores trabajando en esas
integrations so
customizaciones,
as to
a
have several
diferencia de GNS3,
developers
que
working in
solamente
the
es para laboratorios de redes
customations,
normales.
different from GNS3
Absolutamente,
that
sí.
is only
De
for
hecho,
normal
sí,
network laboratories. Yes.
eso es correcto. Containerlab nos permite tener esa
That,
interacción,
that is right.
como dije antes.
So as I said
Para los
earlier,
laboratorios que
for
estuvimos
the
desarrollando para
labs
el evento
that
que
we
tuvimos
developed for the
hace un par de
event
meses,
that we had a couple of months
fue
ago,
muy fácil
it was
interactuar
very
con
easy
Containerlab porque
to
nos
interact,
permitió
to
hacer
do it
esa
with
parametrización y
Containerlab
toda la
because
construcción
we could
del lab
use the
automatizada.
parameters and
Entonces
the
podemos utilizar
automated,
cualquier herramienta
so
que se
we can
encargue
use any tool
y voy más allá. Inclusive podemos
and
utilizar large language
so
models
we can
como
use the
Claude o
language
como
models as
ChatGPT
Claude or
con
ChatGPT
el MCP server
and
correcto y decirle,
CP,
mira,
the correct
genérame
CP
una
server and
topología
say,
de
well,
esta
we
manera
generate a topology like this,
expresada en
expressed
lenguaje
in
humano
human
y
language.
luego
And then
esta herramienta
we can use this
puede
tool.
interpretar eso y
You can
crearnos una
interpret this
topología
and create
automáticamente. O sea,
the topology automatically.
como dicen, the sky is the limit.
So the
Podemos
sky
la
is the
interacción y
limit.
la facilidad que nos
So you
da
have the
hacer
there.
memoras code
It's
para
easy
integrar con otros
to
sistemas
integrate this with other
es bastante amplio.
systems. It's quite broad.
Súper. Bueno, ya para
Good,
casi
wonderful.
finalizar. El señor J.
So, Mr.
Francisco
J. Francisco,
puso su pregunta en
the
inglés,
question is in English,
pero vamos a decirla en
but
español.
we are
Dice
going to say it in Spanish. It
que si
says,
se puede producir un reporte
can you
cuando el
produce a
laboratorio
report when
está
the lab
listo y
is
aprobado.
ready and approved?
Cuando el laboratorio,
When the lab is deployed?
cuando el laboratorio se despliega,
When the
sí.
lab
De
is
hecho,
deployed,
Containerlab,
yes. As a matter
una
of
vez
fact,
desplegado el laboratorio,
once you
y es
deploy
independientemente
the
de cómo lo hagas,
laboratory,
hacemos
regardless of
con
how you use it, whether you use it,
para cerrarlo voy a
whether you
hacer,
do it,
cuando tú vamos a
when
poner este
when
laboratorio,
you,
lo voy a detener.
well, I'm going to stop
¿Ves
this
cómo está?
here.
Ahora los links están en gris.
So you see this
Él
in
muestra
gray.
primero un log.
He shows
Esto lo está
first,
haciendo con el Visual Studio Code.
this
Pero si
is
no es el
being
Visual Studio
done
Code, lo pudiera hacer
with
también en la línea de comando. Pero ahorita lo
I
vemos
can
en
also do it with the
en
command
Visual Studio
line.
porque es
So you can do it with
la
Visual
filosofía de
Studio
este
because
webinar
that's the
o
philosophy
el
of
punto
this
importante de este
webinar.
webinar. Cuando yo le doy play a este lab
When
para
I
que lo
put
despliegue,
deploy
yo
lab,
puedo ver los logs
I
como
can
los que están viendo
see
aquí
the
de
logs
cómo
as
se
you
está creando
see
ese
them
lab,
here,
todos
how
los
the lab
dispositivos,
is being
todos los
created, all
enlaces,
the
si hay
devices, all the
herramientas
links,
post
if there are
deployment, porque
any
también
tools
podemos crear split
for
post deployment que, por
post
ejemplo, entre un
deployment,
nodo
for
y
instance, I
arranquen un
enter
hub
a node
o
and
que creen una interfaz en
it
un
may
nodo Linux.
create
Y al final él
an
nos da un
interface.
summary,
And at
como
the
ven acá,
end,
de todos
we
los
have
nodos
the
que fueron
summary of
creados
all the nodes that
con
were
su dirección IP
created
de
with their
management, ya sea en
IP
IPv4
address,
y también
with
IPv6,
IP4
Alejandro,
and
por si acaso.
IPv4 and IPv6,
Con
and
el nombre,
with
inclusive,
the,
Containerlab hace algo
even with the
muy
name.
interesante, que es que él
That's
crea
very
un servicio
interesting. It
de
creates
naming local,
a service,
de manera
a
tal que yo
local
puedo interactuar con los
service,
nodos
and I can
directamente
interact
con la
with the
dirección IP
nodes with
para
the
hacer
IP
SSH o con el
address
nombre. Él crea
for
él actualiza
ISSH or the
el
name.
archivo de host
So it
de
can
manera tal de que puedo
update
utilizar el nombre
the
en vez de
host
utilizar el IP,
file
lo que
and
hace muy
again use the
inconveniente.
name instead of the
Pero sí,
IP.
generan un
But
resumen
yes, it generates
de si todo
a
salió bien,
summary
sí,
and
sí se
saying
puede hacer.
everything
Y
came
de hecho
out
lo
right.
hace,
Yes, you can do it. And as a
como lo ven
matter of
acá,
fact, it
muestra
does it. As
todo
you
el
can see
despliegue,
it here, it
qué
shows the
salió bien, qué salió
deployment,
mal.
what came out
Inclusive,
right
si
and
quieren ver
wrong.
más detalles,
And if you
pueden
want to
irse
see
nodo
more
por nodo
details, you can go node after node
y ver el
and
log de
see
cada uno de
the
los nodos
log
como tal,
of each of the nodes
cada
as
uno
such.
cuando se desplegó. Por ejemplo, si falló una
For
licencia, te
instance,
lo va a decir
if
acá.
there's
Si falló una imagen, te lo va a decir
if
acá,
a
etcétera.
license failed, you can see it here,
Listo.
etc.
Vale, mira, hay una
Okay,
pregunta
and
y
there's
bueno, vamos a hacer
another
dos más
question.
máximo
Well,
porque ya
two
llegamos a la
more
hora.
Listo.
because it's time already.
Una que está muy interesante
One, there's a question here that's very
del
interesting
señor Ángel Rivero
by Ángel
que
Rivero,
indica,
who
creo que hay una forma de
says,
traerse una
I think
máquina
that there's a
virtual
way we can
QCloud
have a
con
QCow
VRNet Lab.
virtual machine with
Ajá,
your
sí.
lab.
Sí, de hecho, estuve
Yes.
comentando eso.
Si quieres nos hablas de VRNet Lab.
Sí, VRNet
So,
Lab es
yes,
una
VRNet
herramienta o un
Lab
proyecto
is a
abierto
project, an open project that
básicamente
basically
permite
enables you
hacer la integración de
to
nodos basados en VM
integrate
dentro de container.
VM-based
Es un poquito si
nodes
me lo
in the
permite, un
container.
overkill.
It's an overkill,
Porque básicamente
sort
estamos
of, because
encapsulando una
basically we
VM,
are
que es un recurso
encapsulating an
bastante
AVM
heavy
that is quite a
en los
heavy
requerimientos.
resource of the
Lo
requirements.
estamos metiendo en un container.
We are putting it into a container,
Pero,
but
¿funciona? Sí.
does it work?
Que eso es lo
Yes.
importante.
That's the important thing.
Obviamente no es tan
Obviously,
dinámico
it's
al
not
punto de
as
ser despliegue
dynamic from the
como de
point
un
of view
container
of
nativo.
deployment as a native
Y
container.
eso es más o menos como
And
igual como cuando
well, that's
ustedes
more or
tienen
less when
containers o
you
imágenes de
have
containers que están siendo
containers that
diseñadas
are being
para una arquitectura
designed
específica,
for
bien
a
sea para
specific architecture
Intel o
or
ARM64.
Intel or
Tú a
R64.
través de herramientas de
And
translation, tú puedes correr imágenes
with
de
other
Intel en
translation tools,
ARM64,
you
pero
can
obviamente no
run
van a ser
Intel
óptimas,
64
porque vas a necesitar un esfuerzo de
images, but they
traslación, bien sea
won't be
Rosetta
optimum
o lo que
because
sea,
you
para
need
que exista la
Rosette or
traslación
some
entre plataformas.
translation
Aquí
to go from
básicamente lo
one
que se hace
platform
es
to the
eso.
other. But here, what we do is
VRNet
this.
Lab lo que hace es que encapsula
And
esa imagen de QCloud
here
dentro de
we
un container,
encapsulate
crea
this
una
image in a
infraestructura
container and
dentro de ese
create an
container
infrastructure in
para
that
establecer la
container to
comunicación.
establish the communication.
Porque para hacerlo muy dinámico,
And
para
to
hacerlo
do
más
it
fácil,
more dynamic and
esa
easier,
VM que se crea dentro de ese
this is the
container
VM
se
that
crea
was
de
created in
manera,
that
vamos a
container
decirlo
is
así,
created
estándar,
as a
con
standard
la
way,
misma
so
dirección
to
IP
speak,
más
with the
reciente.
same
Entonces, si tú
IP
despliegas
address.
10
As a matter of
imágenes
fact, if you
basadas en
deploy
ese
10
container o en
images
esa VM
based on that
dentro de un
container or
container,
that network within
todas
a
las direcciones
container,
IP de
all
management
the
de ellas van a
IP
ser las
addresses
mismas.
for management are
Lo
going to
que
be the
hace este
same.
container
What
es
this
que
container
crea un
does
modo de
is that it
adaptación
creates
o de
a
traslación
module for
entre el ambiente que
translation
está dentro del
between
container
the
y el ambiente
environment in the
externo.
container and the
Les pongo un
external
ejemplo, por ejemplo,
environment. As an
la imagen
example,
que
well,
usamos
the
previamente
image that
para
we
esta web de
used
Nokia,
for
que
this
era en
Nokia
QCOW,
as QCow,
y la containerizamos
and we
con VRNet Lab,
contained it
usaba
with
siempre la
VRNet
misma
Lab,
dirección IP de
and we
management, pero
always
se creaba
use,
un elemento de
well, we
NAT para
created
hacer
an
la
innate
traslación entre la IP
element to
interna y la
translate from the
IP que está
internal
expuesta para la gestión del
IP
equipo.
and the one that is used
Igual la
for
imagen
the management of the
del
machine.
container se guardaba
Anyway, the
y la
container
configuración en
image
un
was
servidor de FTP
saved,
que se creaba
and the
dentro del
STP
container. Y eso
image that was
básicamente creaba
created in the container.
esa infraestructura
Basically,
de interacción
you
entre el
created
mundo
an interaction
interno hacia la VM y el
between
mundo
the
externo
internal
hacia la
world of the VM and the external world.
Súper.
Good.
Mira, y voy ya con la última
And now,
pregunta.
let me go with the last question.
Lastimosamente, porque
Unfortunately,
siempre pasan estas cosas.
these things happen.
Están preguntando sobre
They
el
are
motor
asking
para
about
correr los
the
contenedores.
drive
¿Es Docker,
to
cierto? ¿O Postman?
to run
No,
the
Docker.
containers is Docker or
En este caso es Docker.
Docker in this
Hay
case.
imágenes que corren sobre Postman,
Yes, there are some images
pero
that
no
may use
todas.
the other, but
Pero
not all of them.
Containerlab está diseñado
But Containerlab is designed
para correr directamente
to
en Docker.
run in Docker directly.
Dale.
Good.
Bueno,
Okay,
Tocayo, no me
so
voy a extender más.
I
No
won't
te voy a
go any
quitar más
further.
tiempo.
I won't
No,
Quiero
tranquilo.
take more of your time.
darte las gracias
So, in
una
the
vez
name of
más por
Lucknick, I
tu
want to thank
tiempo.
you again.
Que disfrutes el evento en el que te encuentras en
So,
Austin.
enjoy your
Bueno,
Austin
muchísimas
event.
gracias por todo.
No,
Sandra,
Thank you
gracias,
for
gracias a
all.
todos. Gracias a la audiencia.
Yes, I
Muchas
want to
gracias.
thank
Las
the
preguntas estuvieron
audience. I want
buenísimas.
to
De
thank
hecho, eso
everybody.
me encanta cuando la gente
I love it
participa.
when
Y
people
bueno,
ask
y
questions. And
espero estar
okay,
de nuevo con ustedes.
and hopefully I'll
Vamos a
be
ver qué
able
les
to
traigo
be
luego
with you
de este
again. Let's
evento.
see what we can
¿Qué se me
bring
ocurre?
after this
Cómo me
event, what I
envenenan
can
la
think of.
cabeza otra vez y
We
les
are,
traigo algo,
it's very
algo
interesting.
nuevo.
I may bring something new.
Perdón, una cosita.
Just a question.
Ernesto Sánchez
Ernesto
estaba en la llamada.
Sanchez was there in the
Ah, sí.
call.
bueno,
Yes.
saludos,
So
Ernesto.
my greetings
Ernesto
to
es uno de
Ernesto.
nuestros colaboradores y ha estado muy participativo con todo el tema de Containerlab. Saludos, un
So,
abrazo grande, Néstor.
thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Me sumo al agradecimiento
So,
de
thank you.
Ale
I want to
Acosta
join
y a
Ale
Alejandro
Acosta
Guevara. Muchas
and
gracias,
Alejandro Guevara. Thank
Muchas
you,
gracias también a todos los
Alejandro, and thank
participantes
you,
por estar
all the
atentos
participants,
a
for
este webinar y
paying
por
close
todas las
attention to the
preguntas.
webinar and for
Si por
all
ahí
your
quedaron algunas
questions. If
preguntas
you have
pendientes de
any pending
respuesta, les
questions,
agradezco. Ale, por favor,
Ale,
compartir
please
el correo. No sé si la
share
diapositiva de su
the
correo de
mail.
Alejandro,
I don't know whether
de
you
ambos,
have Alejandro's,
cosa que
the
puedan
two
hacerle las
Alejandro's
preguntas
mail
que
so
quedaron
that you can
pendientes.
ask any pending questions.
Nada, recuerden que
And
la grabación de
remember
este
that
webinar se las
the
vamos a
recording of this
compartir
webinar will be
al correo
shared
que se registraron a
to
esta sesión.
your
Bueno,
email
nada
addresses
más que decir. Muchas
you
gracias.
register with.
Gracias.
Goodbye. Bye-bye.